The United States is preparing what Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent has described as the toughest sanctions in history against Iran, as Washington looks to intensify economic pressure on Tehran and push the country towards a settlement. Bessent said the new measures would be part of a wider campaign aimed at economically isolating Iran. He suggested that maximum economic pressure could help Washington avoid another large-scale military operation. Speaking to a media network, Bessent said the U.S. would combine its existing blockade with sweeping new sanctions. Bessent said the measures would put further pressure on Iran's economy, adding that the campaign was aimed at forcing Tehran to change course. His remarks came a day after President Donald Trump announced what he called the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. Trump warned that countries providing financial, commercial, or government support to Tehran could face tremendous economic consequences. The campaign is expected to target Iran's economic lifelines, including oil smuggling networks, financial transfers, exchange houses, ship registries, and front companies. But Washington's next major challenge could be China. China remains Iran's biggest oil customer and buys more than 80% of Iran's seaborne oil exports. Any move by Washington to increase pressure on Chinese companies doing business with Iran could have major consequences for the global oil trade. Bessent also urged Beijing to support U.S. efforts to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a crucial energy shipping route at the center of the confrontation. "We are confident that everyone wants the strait reopened and for energy prices to come back down," Bessent said. He added that China gets around 50% of its energy from inside the Gulf and said reopening the strait would also benefit Beijing. When asked whether the U.S. could target China for continuing to do business with Iran, Bessent said some discussions were better held privately. China, however, rejected Washington's approach. A spokesperson for the Chinese embassy in Washington said that sanctions and pressure would not help resolve the conflict and called on all sides to pursue political and diplomatic solutions. Meanwhile, Iran has condemned the U.S. economic and trade sanctions, calling them economic terrorism. Iran's foreign ministry said the measures would not create even the slightest hesitation in the country's determination to protect its independence, dignity, and national sovereignty. Iran has faced near-continuous and severe economic sanctions for almost 50 years, dating back to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. Bessent is expected to hold a press conference on Monday to provide further details about the new sanctions, as Washington moves to ramp up its economic pressure campaign against Tehran. After declaring Hormuz as a U.S. territory, Trump has made another shocking statement. This time, the threat is not for the Iranian regime, but for its allies. Tremendous punishment vow for the countries that help or do business with Iran. President Donald Trump's message is loud and clear. Team Trump is continuing with its pressure campaign against Tehran. The Republican leader has termed it the most crushing economic operation ever taken against any country. He has made a list of activities that need to be stopped. This threat comes after Iran mocked Trump's "Hormuz is U.S. territory" remark. Iran responded with a satirical post, showing a map of the U.S., with California labeled as new territory of Islamic Republic. Iran also strongly responded to Trump's economic D-Day feat, saying that it is a diversion from America's own crisis. Foreign Minister Syed Abbas Araghchi highlighted the U.S. unprecedented debt and surging interest costs. The United States is sending the aircraft carrier USS George Washington to the Middle East to replace the USS Abraham Lincoln, as growing concerns over crew morale and living conditions aboard the Lincoln raise questions about the toll of its unusually long deployment. But U.S. officials told a U.S. media network that the carrier swap is part of a previously planned rotation and is not a direct response to the concerns surrounding the Lincoln. The move comes as families and lawmakers have raised alarm over reports of severe burnout and deteriorating living conditions aboard the Lincoln after more than 250 days at sea. There have also been reports of multiple sailors attempting to go overboard, with at least one sailor reportedly stopped by another crew member. The roughly 5,000 sailors and Marines aboard the nuclear-powered carrier left San Diego on November 21st for what was initially planned as a Pacific deployment. But that mission changed after the U.S. war with Iran began on February 28, when the carrier was redirected to the Middle East. According to lawmakers, the Lincoln has now spent more than 200 consecutive days without a port call, putting the crew and the Navy's ability to sustain such prolonged operations to an extraordinary test. Families have described growing psychological strain among sailors, including concerns over suicidal thoughts and reported attempts to jump overboard. At a tense meeting in San Diego attended by around 200 relatives, families confronted acting Navy Secretary Hung Chow and senior commanders over the deployment and the uncertainty surrounding when the crew would return home. The U.S. Navy, however, has pushed back against claims of a worsening mental health crisis aboard the Lincoln. The service says it has not identified an increase in reported suicidal thoughts or suicide attempts on the carrier. The Navy also says sailors have access to counselors and chaplains, along with clean water and healthy meals. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has also rejected reports of poor conditions aboard the ship, calling them completely misrepresented. The Navy has acknowledged, however, that the war disrupted traditional supply hubs in the Middle East, contributing to shortages and delays involving food, hygiene supplies, and mail. Now, the USS George Washington and its accompanying strike group are heading toward the region as the United States maintains a major naval presence amid the conflict with Iran and continuing tensions around the Strait of Hormuz. The United States and Iran were locked in a rapidly escalating confrontation in early 2026, with tensions finally spilling into open war on February 28, when the U.S. and Israel launched major airstrikes on Iran. The strikes targeted Iran's nuclear and ballistic missile infrastructure and aimed to weaken its military capabilities and leadership. Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was killed in the opening strikes. Tehran quickly hit back with missile and drone attacks targeting Israel, U.S. military positions, and sites across the Middle East. Iran also moved to shut the strategically important Strait of Hormuz, taking the conflict far beyond the immediate U.S.-Iran confrontation and putting a major global energy route at risk. For more than 3 months, the fighting continued, with waves of missile strikes, air attacks, and retaliatory operations. Gulf states were increasingly caught in the middle as Iranian attacks and the wider regional conflict threatened U.S. bases, energy infrastructure, and maritime traffic. By June, however, Washington and Tehran began looking for a way out. After negotiations involving regional mediators, the two sides reached an interim framework aimed at stopping the fighting and creating room for talks on Iran's nuclear program, sanctions, and wider regional security. In June, the U.S. and Iran signed the Islamabad Memorandum of Understanding. The deal called for an immediate halt to military operations and barred both sides from launching further attacks against each other. It also provided for a 60-day ceasefire, the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, and steps to ease economic pressure on Iran, including measures related to oil exports and the U.S. blockade of Iranian ports. The ceasefire sharply reduced direct U.S.-Iran attacks and was meant to serve as a bridge toward a lasting peace agreement. But the underlying disputes over Iran's nuclear and missile programs, sanctions, and regional security remained unresolved, and the truce soon began to show cracks. Washington and Tehran continued to disagree over the memorandum, particularly on the Strait of Hormuz, sanctions, and the U.S. naval blockade. By August, the 60-day diplomatic window had effectively broken down. The U.S. said it would not extend the ceasefire, while Iran accused Washington of failing to honor its commitments. Tehran has since warned that it could adopt a more offensive military posture if diplomacy fails.